Senator Elizabeth Warren's latest presidential campaign plan is aimed at rewriting labor laws. Doing so would have a profoundly positive effect on unions, who overall poured roughly $219 million into the last presidential election.
According to Warren, her goal is to, quote, return power to the working people, calling her proposal the most progressive and comprehensive agenda for workers since the New Deal. Joining us via Skype to discuss Senator Warren's plan, how it compares to some of the other candidates' proposal, is Joe Dinkin. Currently serves as the campaign's director for the Working Families Party. Joe, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Good to see you, Joe.
Thanks for having me on the show this morning, guys.
Absolutely. So, Joe, we got the release of this plan yesterday. The Intercept's Ryan Grimm broke it down for us. A little bit of what he talked about was that the inclusion of Elizabeth Warren's non-compete clause is really the main distinguisher to the plan released by Bernie Sanders. What also stood out to you?
So I think the non-compete clause is big. It's something that gets used up and down the economic ladder against workers. There's some other really important provisions in there that I think have gone a little bit undernoticed, including Warren's support for fair scheduling provisions. If you've ever worked shift work in low-wage industries, you know that there can be some really abusive practices, including changing schedules at the last minute, including forcing people to work a closing shift one night and then an opening shift the next morning that's only a couple hours later. So some cities and states around the country have started to implement these fair scheduling provisions that are especially critical in the service industry that Warren has put inside of this plan to make part of federal law, and I think that's really exciting. I think overall what we're looking at is an incredibly ambitious and broad scope plan to shift power away from bosses and towards workers, and it's something that's long overdue. And reading the plan yesterday for the first time, it was I was really enthusiastic about a lot of the pieces in it that are both enacting a lot of the big ideas of the that we've heard from union activists and progressives, and also introducing some new ones that really haven't been in the mainstream of debate.
Yeah, I think that fair scheduling thing is so important. I mean, if you, especially not especially, but if you have kids and you're trying to figure out childcare and you don't have any visibility, like who's going to watch your kids when you're working till 2 a.m. and then you're back in at 6 a.m.? I mean, it's completely insane. Not to mention you're probably not making enough money on one job to support yourself, but you don't have a regular schedule, so you can't take on a second job. I think that's a really important piece that I'm glad is in there. One other thing that Ryan pointed out yesterday when he was in for me was that Sanders' plan has this element to create a sectoral collective bargaining system with industry-wide boards, not in Warren's plan. Do you see that as significant, and do you think that that's something that she also would support?
I think that sectoral bargaining approach is actually in Warren's plan as well, I'm pretty sure.
Just to jump in here, Joe, one thing that Ryan had pointed out was that the sectoral bargaining, but also the wage board in particular, was what the major distinguisher that he found was that Elizabeth Warren is not committing to having a wage board which would set industry standard wages, and instead to have more of a market approach. Is that the way that you see it, or are we missing something here?
Warren's plan focused on sectoral bargaining, which is, sectoral bargaining is the approach used by a lot of European countries, for example, which have kept worker power strong even as membership in unions has declined. The way that membership in unions has declined in America, worker power remains strong because workers can band together not just within a company but across an industry and negotiate collectively with the industry, which has been a powerful tool for protecting wages and keeping wages high in lots of northern European countries, which is, I think, a really important approach. She doesn't propose wage boards in the proposal, as far as I saw. One thing that she does propose that I thought was a really important difference is this idea of putting worker representatives on corporate boards, giving over at large companies 40% of the total board seats to workers. So when you talk about rebalancing a broken system, rebalancing power between workers and bosses, nothing does so more directly than putting workers in partial charge of the companies they work at.
What other things do you think are significant in this plan? And ultimately, how much do you think that this changes the rates of unionization? Because one thing that we talk about on the show, that at least I talk about, I think that the decline in rates of unionization is one of the most significant and one of the most undercovered trends of our generation. I mean, you know as well as I do, if you look at the data, as the number of union members declines, so goes the middle class. So if this plan were fully implemented, what do you think the upside could be for rates of unionization?
Yeah, I think it would have a dramatic effect. If for one, it bans right-to-work laws, and we've seen right-to-work laws enacted by right-wing state governments in state after state. As you do it, it's no surprise. In Wisconsin, the unionization rate dropped dramatically after Act 10. When you pass anti-worker, anti-union legislation, when you make it harder to join a union, unionization rates go down, and that's been the point. Rolling back and reversing those kinds of anti-worker legislation would be a huge step. Warren's plan specifically bans right-to-work laws, specifically guarantees public sector workers the right to unionize. So imagine the kind of impact that a unionized public sector could have to help set standards in a place like North Carolina or Georgia, where public sector organizing is banned right now.
Joe, where do you think that Warren's plan is better than Bernie's plan? I mean, ultimately, it is a zero-sum game. You guys did endorse Elizabeth Warren. Why is this plan better than the previous one?
So the first thing I'll say is I think it's actually really a good thing that we have two candidates who are putting forward big and bold and pro-worker ideas, who are pushing each other in some ways. And I think that's really a good thing for the health of our debate, for the health of the democracy, and for the Democratic field as a whole. I think the strongest points that are in Warren's plan that are not in the Sanders plan are the fair scheduling provision, and then the worker corporate governance provision. Now, I don't think that's to say Sanders wouldn't support those if you asked them, but I think in some ways it's a matter of emphasis. And I think as on things like the wealth tax, as on things like debt relief, having two candidates putting forward plans to fundamentally rebalance a society that's far out of whack, where a wealthy few have a huge share of the power that is eroding our democracy. I think it's a good thing that we have these two candidates in the race. But for those who are looking at Warren's plan, it's an incredible, comprehensive, exciting plan that would truly shift power towards workers and away from bosses. And I think that's the most important takeaway from it.
Do you think that this represents a new direction in the Democratic Party? Because for years now, I mean, it seems to me like Republicans have understood very well how important unions are in the Democratic Party coalition. Democrats, not so much. I mean, there's still plenty of anti-union, anti-labor Democrats in the caucus and across the country. So do you think that we're seeing a sort of decisive shift towards understanding just how critical unions are to this coalition?
Crystal, all I can say is I hope so. I think in part, and you know this history, but the Working Families Party was in part formed in reaction to that rightward drift in the Democratic Party, particularly on issues of workers' rights and support for the labor movement. It's been, in some ways, a long decline. The DLC era was in a lot of ways about a Democratic Party shifting to be as much on the side of corporate leaders as workers. And we think that's been a huge problem. And to see candidates like Senator Warren and also like Bernie Sanders shifting so dramatically back in the direction that we want to see, back in the direction of being willing to stand up for workers over bosses, being willing to stand up for consumers over banks, for example, the way that Senator Warren did with the Consumer Financial Protections Board. I think that's been an incredibly positive shift in the Democratic Party. And I think as candidates like that become more and more successful, my hope is that more Democrats will see the writing on the wall.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Have a good one.
Coming up, we're going to take a closer look at the presidential candidates' campaign coffers.
And Cable News Network's commission of a candidate on a campaign finance graphic has Twitter and us shaking our heads.
Amazing.
I think you might guess who. Our panel is next as Rising continues.